I'm Cheryl Sterling, the Director of the Black Studies Program, and welcome to our event honoring our esteemed professor, Herb Boyd, and celebrating the success of his amazing book, Detroit. Now, in saying that, that's all I'm going to say about Herb. All right? My position here tonight is just to introduce the overall program and to talk a little bit about Black Studies. Black Studies has been going through an amazing revitalization, and we've been able to really transform the program over the last few years. I don't know how many of you have been to our events, but we tend to, bring in some amazing people and create a wonderful link with the community. So in saying this, I'm inviting you to come back after this event, to look us up on the website, CCNY's website. So you look us up at ccnycuny.edu/blackstudies. To kind of take a look at what we've been doing also on Facebook, if anyone is still going to use Facebook. We are at Black Studies CCNY at Facebook. And after this event, please share your joy in it by tweeting out at IamBSP, which is our Twitter account. So in saying that, also, I have to apologize to her because I cannot stay during this, this event. But I am looking forward, well, we've spoken many times, of course, but I am looking forward to looking at the tape and hearing all the stories about the different avenues that your life has taken you to. You all who know, I said I wasn't going to say anymore, but you all who know Herb know that he's a walking who's who. He's known everybody, he's done everything, and so this is going to be a really special event in hearing him recap some of his life. Now, again, it's my pleasure to introduce the person who is going to be the moderator for the event, and that is our own Professor LaRue Lewis McCoy. And Professor McCoy is an associate professor of sociology and Black Studies at City College. He's also a professor of sociology, part of the doctoral faculty at the graduate school, CUNY. He specializes in racial and ethnic relations with research and activism that concentrates on educational equality, race-related public policy, and gender justice. His first book, Inequality in the Promised Land, is a must-read, especially for those who are interested in education and what it's doing to our students across the board. So I welcome you all, and I open the floor to Professor Lewis McCoy, and please enjoy the event.
Thank you to our fearless leader in Black Studies, Dr. Cheryl Sterling, our director. And in a moment, I'll sit down to speak with a man who, for many of you, needs no introduction. But at the risk of boring some of you and teaching many of you, Herb Boyd is an author, an educator, and a journalist who originally was born in Birmingham, Alabama. But if you know him, you know his true roots lie in the great city of Detroit, where he grew up and attended Wayne State University. And he graduated from Wayne State University in the late 60s and was so bad that upon immediately graduating, he began teaching in Black Studies, right? So, and I mean that literally. And his work for years at Wayne State was followed up with a trek out to Oberlin, where he served as an instructor in anthropology and ethnomusicology. This is a man who is a journalist. This is a man who has been mentored by some of the greatest musicians you've ever known. He's also written in a range of publications as a journalist, including the Amsterdam News, the Black World. His writing has been featured in the Black Scholar. And around 1986, he made his foray into New York's academic sphere in working at the College of New Rochelle. And in his work there, he continued to expose the conditions facing Black people. And we were lucky enough in the 2000s to receive the gift known as Herb Boyd. Now, I have to say the first time I met Herb Boyd was again in written form, because the man who sits to my right, Black Detroit, represents the 25th book that he has written or edited. the 25th, right? In and of itself. So some of Herb's many titles, and I cannot list them all for sure: African History for Beginners, Brother Man, The Odyssey of Black Men in America, The Harlem Reader, which is on sale back there from Sisters Uptown Books, as well as he has done work on We Shall Overcome, the history of the civil rights movement as it happened, as well as a recent volume, By Any Means Necessary, which is a critique and a corrective to many of the conversations around Brother Malcolm, as well as Baldwin's Harlem. And it's my esteemed honor today to be in conversation with him today, and hope that we all can have a rich conversation about Black Detroit, but also Blackness and beyond.
I'm gonna take him on the road with me.
I wouldn't be able to hang, man. I wouldn't be able to hang.
That's wonderful. Thank you for such a sterling introduction. I'm sorry that Cheryl has to get out of here, but she's left the room in good hands, I think. It's such a pleasure, an opportunity. It's kind of a reunion, too, in so many respects, to see some of my former students. Some of them go back quite a ways. And a few I hope to return to the academy in the spring and kind of close out my career. You know, I've been teaching so long. It's like Miles Mabley used to say, I don't know if I've been here too long or won't be here much longer. But 1967 is when I started in the classrooms of America. And as LaRue say, back in Wayne State University, it was a very tumultuous period, very turbulent times in which Black studies came into existence. Student power. That's why it's so inspirational to see all the young people taking to the streets nowadays in terms of the whole gun control and the whole Black Lives Matter. And Adrian, Black teachers matter too, you know? One of the things about Mr. McCoy, this is the real McCoy, y'all. Those of you who purchased the book, you'll see right away there's a collection of photos in the book. And there's one photo of Elijah McCoy. They called him the real McCoy too. I don't know if there's any kind of a lineage connected there, you know. Maybe we all came from the same plantation, you know, at some point. But I think they called him the real McCoy because he was such a prolific innovator, inventor. And he had so many inventions out there. And in order to kind of protect the authenticity and the legacy of his name, and also to give credit to how just absolutely incredible his creativity was, they called him the real McCoy. All imitators, you know, step aside. This is the real dude. And listening to your introduction, I'm reminded that you continue that particular spirit, and you've done your homework. You know, sometimes people introduce folks and they have no idea who the person is. And so consequently, the audience don't know either. So that may be a good thing to some degree. But let me say that this day has been kind of a roller coaster for me. I spent the morning at Abyssinia Baptist Church. We lost one of our legends, Les Payne, the consummate journalist, and a person that I deeply respected and admired. And he died last Monday. And we had his homegoing today, and it was just a remarkable turnout of people there on a work day in New York City to have a crowded sanctuary. And one of his sons stood up and read from the obituary and said that less often in talking to particularly aspiring journalists, McCoy, you know, would say things like, tell the truth, and duck. Well, I have no doubts that Les told the truth, but I doubt seriously if he ever ducked.
That's right. That's right.
Because he was such a fearless individual. So the point is, gang, is that, from commemoration to celebration, we commemorate and remember the outstanding contributions of Les Payne. And we come together here in a moment of joy and celebration. And I certainly appreciate all of you coming out, both future and former students. See you in the spring, okay? Go ahead, Laura.
Great. So when I heard about this book, folks were like, Herb Boyd wrote a book. And I was like, right? And they were like, he wrote a book on Detroit. And I was like, that's good. But then when I heard the title, I was like, I've got to read it, right? I want you first to just speak to us about the title of Black Detroit, right? And its relationship to this concept of self-determination, of really the people's history of self-determination.
I think that's probably the most important thing about the title is the subtitle, self-determination. Because there's a few, I want to see the show of hands of former Detroiters or someone has some connection to Detroit. Are you in the house? Detroit in the house?
Come on, Detroit.
One, okay,
There's a lot of
two,
Detroit
three,
in this.
4, 5, 6. Oh, y'all a long way from home. But you're right at home too, because Detroit is, somebody asked me in one of the readings I had, say, Herb, how long did it take you to write that book? And I said, 79 years. 79 years, because basically it's, the book is part autobiography, part memoir, part love letter, and certainly the biography in there is my mother. I sat with her when I had an opportunity to do the book, LaRue. I sat with my mother, and I'd already interviewed her on many occasions because she's a kind of a veritable walking historian herself, an encyclopedia of information about the history of Detroit. She arrived in Detroit when she was 20 years of age from Birmingham, Alabama. That's where I was born, in Birmingham, Alabama. That's what I was telling. Les Payne and I used to be on Like It Is, the Gil Noble's television show on ABC, along with Milton Alamati, Black Star Press publisher, an outstanding journalist, a guerrilla journalist, we call him. And one of the things about going back to those days and talking about the period of time in which we live, and of course some of my students figured I've been around to have known Frederick Douglass, not on a first-hand basis, but but the whole point is that my mother, I sat with her and we started reminiscing and going over things. She's 98 years old in May. I mean, I dedicated the book to her, obviously. It was really her book more than my book. But it was the exchange that went on between us, in which probably the only argument we had was, the sequence of places that we lived in the city. Sometimes we argue, say, oh, we lived in the Jeffries Projects before we lived in Paradise Valley and down in Black Bottom and out on the North End and out on 8 Mile Road. So we argue sometimes, about the sequences, but we were in agreement in terms of the number of places. I lived all over the city. I grew up with the city. And Charles, when you go into a neighborhood and you make that connection with people, then you're almost intimately tied to them. And I found myself going back to the old neighborhood. So that's pretty much what I had to do in writing Black Detroit, is to go back to these old neighborhoods in my mind, remember some of those individuals. So, in effect, I know where all the bodies are buried. I grew up you know, when you spend like 50 years in a community and then in and out of it for another 45 years, you know, all those things are so deeply, almost like DNA. It's so deeply imprinted on you. You never forget some of those things. The book is done episodically. That is, like every 10 years in Detroit's history, there's a major event, a major moment. And LaRue is connected to, has national and sometimes international implications. You know, what happens in Detroit? They used to say that when Detroit sneezed, the nation came down with pneumonia. To show you how vital it was to the whole economic engine. Certainly the automobile industry being key to that. But even long before that, you have a history of manufacturing in Detroit. But before we get to that, maybe we can talk a bit about some of the early years.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. In fact, one of the things I love about the book is that it's very well researched, right? So for all my students and history lovers, there are footnotes galore, right? and we know Detroit and we know it as a black city, but you take us way back. In fact, you take us to the beginning. And for a number of years, I lived in Michigan. I'll never forget when I was over by the Detroit River on the Riverwalk. I looked up and there was this statue. And I was like, well, I know black folks been in Detroit, but it was a monument to the Underground Railroad. So I would like you to just speak a little bit about kind of like that rich history that relates to our people, to the Underground Railroad, to slavery, to fugitivity.
That's an important element in terms of for me, geography is fate. The great writer said that. I didn't make that up. It was Ralph Ellison, I think. It was somebody else even before he did. But I think it's true. Detroit, geographically, is located in the middle of the country, more or less. You know, the Great Lakes, you know, it's the terminal point for the Underground Railroad. Straight line migration from Alabama. So all those blues people, those fugitives fleeing from the plantations in Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, it was a straight shot from Alabama to Detroit. Some of them took the Underground Railroad, and obviously we're not talking about the A train or the D train. This is a path that was carved out from individuals who were fleeing the atrocities of servitude in this country. Harriet Tubman, you've heard of her, made many, many trips into the bowels, into the belly of the beast, rescuing her people. The numbers are staggering and sometimes exaggerated, who knows how many, but it was a countless number of occasions when she felt compelled to go down into Dixie and rescue her people out of bondage. Some 300, they say, some 19 trips. However number, even if it was just one, it was a miraculous and a courageous effort on her part. So there's that connection in, you know, the Alabama-Detroit connection. I arrived in Detroit in 1943, a couple of months before the race riot broke out. He said, hello, welcome to Detroit. What? You know, and the streets are ablaze with terror and fire and gunshots and what have you. But that had been, I didn't know then, but if you go back all the way to the slavery period, a lot of people don't realize slavery was in Detroit, just like slavery was here in New York. One of the points I tried to make in Black Detroit, LaRue, was to draw some parallels, some comparisons between Detroit and Harlem, certainly between Detroit and New York. And there's so many commonalities. It's just amazing. After a while, my editor got on my case. Said, Herb, this is a Detroit book. You write your New York book later, you know. So all of the stuff that she cut out, some 500 pages, you know, just threw it aside. I said, okay, that'll be my history of Harlem, my Black New York book.
Right on.
Which I'm working on right now, y'all. I'm working on it right now. And I think it's important to kind of show the connection, because Detroit then becomes kind of emblematic, symbolic of the Black experience in America. In so many ways, I think it's a synthesis of looking at, you know, the whole historical development coming out of slavery, the Underground Railroad, that terminal point, And New York has a similar kind of experience. Once you reach New York, Frederick Douglass arrived in New York in 1838, down there where Stuyvesant High School is today. But he discovered he had to go a little bit further, particularly after 1850 when they had the Fugitive Slave Act. And it was like open season, not that the bounty hunters needed any special occasion, you know, to grab people off the street. And in 1833 in Detroit, you had the Blackburn couple who had fled from Louisville, Kentucky, and arrived in Detroit. This is Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. What's an extraordinary couple. Just an extraordinary moment in Detroit's history. And it begins to give you that kind of focal point in terms of understanding slavery there. They are runaway slaves from Louisville, but the bounty hunters are in pursuit and finally catch up with them. But the aroused black community at that time, and a few whites too, we're talking about the abolitionist movement. It was a solid, constructed development in Detroit, as it was in New York when Frederick Douglass arrived and ran into David Ruggles. We had a David Ruggles type in Detroit, William Lambert, and he had a number of associates, George D. Baptiste and William Webb, and Frances Richards and her brother John. All of these were involved in this abolitionist movement, making sure, protecting runaway fugitives from the South. So that is kind of the beginning of things. You know, even this is after Cadillac, the French explorer, arrives there. The book covers 300 years of history. But the central point, of course, is to look at the black experience within the context of that. I mean, you can tell a story in so many different ways. You know, you can look at it from the economic, political, cultural, socio-economic, the music, the dance, the theater, the poetry. There's so many ways you can examine a people's history. But I try to incorporate a number of those things as I move from decade to decade. So the slave period is important to understand that it's the first obstacle that these Africans running from, you know, the South, arriving into Detroit, and thinking they reached the promised land, the other side of the Cotton Curtain, and discovered they have to go across the river into Canada. And we're going to see this happening again and again in the 18th, early parts of the 18th and into the 19th century even. Mm-hmm.
Great, great. One of the things that you also talk about are just the consistent contribution of black folks to create things culturally and institutionally. And so you speak about folks like the Pelham Brothers and the emergence of the black press and other institutions of black political power. Can you tell us a little bit about that history, but also how in 2018 you see the role of things like the black press and political power?
It's more important now than ever. Obviously, we're living in the digital age. We're in this universe now where the printed versions are disappearing left and right. I was just thinking about that earlier today in terms of the paper that I have helped found in Detroit. It's called the Metro Times. Those of you who know anything about Detroit know that the Metro Times was the kind of the alternative paper answer to what we once upon a time had here in New York called the Village Voice. And this is the alternative press at that time, but now it does not exist. The Metro Times is barely hanging on. Everything's online. You have a few that at the Amsterdam News, we continue to put out a printed version. The lifeblood of a black newspaper over the years has been the classified ads. It used to be about 4 pages of classified ads. We're down to a couple of pages now. You know, that's where individuals take out small ads, you know. You know, I was just asking about you. Take out small ads, you know, to sell a refrigerator or used car, you know, what have you. But that's just shrinking, it's diminishing, decreasing all the time. So it makes it very difficult to put a publication out. Once upon a time, and I was just earlier before I came, I was talking to Don Rojas. He lives down in Randallstown, Charles, with you. And we put together an online publication back in 1996. It was called The Black World Today. It's amazing, we were like too far out in front of the curve. You know, .com was suddenly .gone for us. And now you can see the proliferation, as we speak. At least 100 new websites were created, if not 1,000, depending on the global aspects of it. It's a veritable forest out there. So that's where it all is happening. It's happening online. That's good. I think in terms of the whole mass communication, some of us predicted that a long time ago. If you read your McLuhan reports, if you read your Vance Packers, the whole hidden persuaders and stuff like that, the whole history of journalism and where it's going. Currently, when the movie The Post came out, it pushed a lot of people back into looking at the whole history of the New York, looking at the Newsweek magazine or the Washington Post, the Catherine and Phil Graham, the Pentagon Papers, of Daniel Ellsberg. But I think it's still a crying need out there to have that kind of tactical thing. A lot of people want to feel something in their hands. They can take the Nook and the Kindle reader to the toilet with them. Because we can say, but some people want to have that paper in their hand. They want to feel, see the ink stains on their hand, what have you. I have that same thing. I'm kind of a both and person, not an either or. I think that comes to a number of things. Just looking at the press, the Amsterdam News is the oldest black paper in this country. And Eleanor Tatum, the publisher and the editor-in-chief there, has been absolutely heroic, in keeping that paper going. It's a rough meeting payrolls sometimes when your advertising base is just shrinking and disappearing. The only time you can really count on maybe Macy's or used to be Alexander's, is around those particular seasons of the year, going back to school or Easter, Christmas, and what have you. But then there's a whole dry period after that, trying to meet payroll, so much so that you begin to kind of close the shop down on certain days. It's not, for all through the summer months, the Amsterdam News is not open on Friday, because you're trying to cut back the cost of keeping, the expenses of keeping it rolling in order to keep people on the job. Because people depend on those payrolls. Even some of us struggling freelancers look forward to the little $40 a story. That's why you have to put so many in. You got to make it pay for you, from week to week. But that's all part of it. Once you have that opportunity, you jump in there. I think the future of the black press is moving more and more. I look at the National Association of Black Journalists. We talk about a Les Payne and some of these individuals who are real pioneers. They're leaving us, but they're leaving us a legacy too, a legacy of struggle and commitment. That's one of the things you want to pick up, no matter what kind of publication or production you're into. What kind of information are you processing? To what extent are you teaching? To what extent are you delivering the goods? That's the most important thing.
Great. One of the things that is also fascinating about the book is the way in which you tell people stories from the ground up, right? So there's a proverb that until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will glorify the hunter. And so I'm used to reading about things like the uprisings of '67, or even some of the things that happened around the Sweet family, but not usually from the perspective that you brought. So say a little bit about how, as a journalist, as an author, how you approach these moments of unrest, right? And how you frame it out for us.
And it's a proliferation of that. It's so pervasive in the history of most of the urban centers in this country. Detroit is just an example of like this tension that's created when you have the ongoing menace of racism. It's a systemic situation. Detroit is not immune from that, not in any sense of the word. And I saw it very early when I arrived in 1943, and my mother come running into the house, and after seeing a man shot in half, a black man running out of a pawn shop with an armload of clothes, was asked to halt. And he kept running, and they mowed him down. My mother saw that, and she came back in the house, and she didn't go back out anymore. But the city raged, for 4.5, 5 days. Some 34 people were killed. Those numbers would be reversed in 1967 with the rebellion. It would be 43 killed then. But between those two moments, though, you're talking about the turmoil, you're talking about the turbulence of the city, and what are some of the conditions that bring about this kind of cataclysmic clash, you know, in socioeconomic. Whether you go back to 1863, there is a major riot in Detroit, similar to the draft riots here in New York City. Here I am drawing parallels again.
It's going to be a
It's
great
inevitable. It has to happen because I think that's important too, because you begin to show the ramifications and the similarities, you know, of the Black experience from one community to another. Detroit is not unique, we're trying to say. You know, what you see there, it may have what you call the larger picture of it, because you have a concentration of African American people there. That's why they call it now, you know, it's a Black city, but it wasn't always Black. You know, I mean, now it's gotten down to the fact that, you know, the flight from the city used to be white folks running from Detroit, but you got a good number of African Americans now who are settling in the suburbs. And for the same reasons, because the city is not delivering, you know, particularly for their children. And the whole education system there was in disarray. It's fallen apart, almost as a consequence of the bankruptcy. And we had the largest municipal bankruptcy in the nation's history. And you're still recovering from that. And much of that, the catalyst, if you go back and look at some of the seminal moments, it has to do with the city being torn apart by racial tension. In 1863, it was the Irish and the Blacks in competition for jobs. The Civil War, boom, is raging. Abraham Lincoln is slammed up against the wall. You know, how does he make a move in terms of even talking about the Emancipation Proclamation? And so at last, you know, he's able to do that. But before that, the conscription acts are passed and young white men are drafted to fight in the Civil War. As soon as they leave the job, a Black man show up and take that job. So that creates a lot of hostility, you know, particularly in the Irish community at that time. So boom, it just rages all over the place as it did here in New York City. They're still trying to determine how many people were killed, William, during the draft riots of 1863 here in New York City. It's almost like the Tulsa riots out of 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You know, some of the other, you know, major upsurges and upheavals, and they tried to determine like what was the cause and what were the consequences and how long it would take that particular region, city, or locale to recover. Detroit is still recovering from the riot of 1943, still recovering from the rebellion of 1967. You know, not only in terms of like racial animosity, but in terms of the economic and property loss. And then the flight of people, the shrinking revenue base. Because if the manufacturing center disappears in Detroit, that was the mother's milk. That was the lifeblood of the city, the manufacturing. Before the automobile, you know, the carriages that they built there, the Fisher body built these buggies and wagons and carriages before they built cars. And then then you have like the whole steel, the manufacturing, what was happening with stoves. Detroit was a major stove maker in the whole country. So they already had that kind of manufacturing, entrepreneurial insight and genius of creativity. And then later on, we're going to see how that's going to be replicated. Even you move into the Ford Motor Company and beyond, and look at Motown.
That's right.
That?
Yeah.
In terms of how Berry Gordy took some of the ideas out of the whole assembly line, working on the assembly line and superimpose that whole concept on the recording industry and create this empire. You know, Terrence Howard. Go ahead.
No. And in fact, speak on it. So one of the things that is a thread that runs through the book is music. And I think if I read correctly, you were mentored by Yusef Lateef, right? How does music play into Detroit's local and our collective history?
Oh, my goodness. that's, we talk about the different kind of perspectives you can take on telling a city's history or people's history. And music is, Detroit and music, inextricably connected. No matter what kind of music you're talking about, because early on, when syncopation, was first arriving before W.C. Handy. Matter of fact, W.C. Handy, so-called father of the blues, he lifted a lot of that stuff from Detroit musicians. But that's not unusual to find people who have mobility, who can move around. Eli Whitney had mobility. When he put together the cotton gin, because he could go from one plantation to another, while the enslaved people could not. They were lucky to go more than 25 miles from their point of enslavement in their whole lifetime. But he's able to move around so we can see the various contraptions, the kind of innovations, the very crude, ways in which the worker is trying to make his job a lot easier. And then go from one plantation to another and take a little bit here, a little bit there, put it together, assemble it. I got the idea. And there, and boom, you have the cotton gin. Well, you have people who were doing the same thing in terms of looking at the whole music development in this country. W.C. Handy, he was the first to really notate the music, but he getting that inspiration from the creativity, the very genius of these musicians. Many of them migrated from other parts of the country, mainly from Ohio. They were coming from what you call the near environs of the Middle East, ended up in Detroit. I can point out any number of musicians who had that same kind of path. But at one time, you had major ensembles and orchestras all over that city. I look at some of the McKinney's Cotton Pickers is probably the most instrumental of those ensembles in the 1920s. And playing at the major ballrooms, Greystone Ballroom, the Arcadia, even at some of the theaters in town. And then when you jump from there all the way down to the 1950s, at one time in America, no matter what ensemble, orchestra, trio, quintet, quartet, had a Detroit musician in that ensemble, in that band, to show you just how it was a cauldron of musical development there. And that's what Berry Gordy took advantage of later on when he came. He knew all this talent existed there. It was a matter of assembling it, pulling it together. So he can take Eddie and Brian Holland and put him with Lamont Dozier and a Norman Whitfield. You can put it and put them in with Smokey Robinson. Without Smokey, you have no Motown. He was the poet, he was the genius, and Berry recognized that and brought him in, and they collaborated in such a very, very munificent way. And then was to bring all these other folks in, the Diana Ross and the Supremes, to bring in, David and the Temptations, to bring in the Four Tops, to bring in that young, sightless individual from Saginaw named Stevie Wonder. Here's a Marvin Gaye, what's going on, y'all? You dig it? All of these things, is a part of that conglomeration, this empire that he pulled together. But in the studio, it was the jazz musicians. Yeah, world-class musicians performing in the studios. They were just not rock and roll or, pop musicians. No. They were world-class and highly trained, had gone through some of the classical academies there, the conservatories and what have you. So they were prepared to play any kind of music. They could do a polka or a bar mitzvah, you name it. They could be there to perform that music. But for the most part, their interest was like into their culture, producing, whether it was rock and roll or rhythm and blues or straight up blues, and certainly jazz. And bebop, when it came along in the 1950s, with Charlie Parker taking up residence in Detroit, with Miles Davis taking up residence in Detroit. Sometimes, people were attracted to New York for any number of reasons, mainly the theater, you want to get on Broadway, you want to get into the recording industry. The attraction, people came to Detroit because it was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. people talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but it was more than just New York City. That Renaissance was happening all over the country to certain degrees. Perhaps it was most pronounced in New York, given the sizable population and the opportunities and possibilities. But I just recently read a book called Smoketown about the history of this here Renaissance that was occurring in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. You know, there's one coming out called Black Toledo. You know, can you imagine that? Yes, indeed. Yep, Virginia, there's a Black Toledo. And the thing about it is that they fed into, you know, some of the other cities in and around, because Toledo, Cleveland, Youngstown. Once you're moving across that, the Erie Canal thing, Gary Bird, Imhotep Gary Bird and I shared space with him on radio a couple of nights a week, and he came from Buffalo. Talk about Rick James and Ishmael Reed. So each one of these communities, you have these individuals that you can celebrate, and you can honor, and you can talk about. Detroit has just so many of them. I needed all of those pages, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the cultural magnificence of the city. And particularly the music thing is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
I'm going to open it up to questions from y'all in a moment. But my own question that I want to hear you talk to a little bit. So Detroit is a cauldron for music, but it's also this cauldron for like Black radical thought and action. You know, Jimmy Boggs, Malcolm X, Drum, Republic of New Africa. Many of us kind of skip over that. Can you speak a little bit to why that makes Detroit unique, and what that can also tell us about just the limits and possibilities of Black radical action?
I think one of the starting point for that is the automobile industry and the union movement. There's a concentration of workers there, African Americans who arrived in those plants, talking about the big three, and any number of other smaller plants in the city of Detroit. People forgot all about, Packard and Studebaker, all these other cars. Because my mother worked at the plants during the World War II. She was kind of like a Black Rosie the Riveter. You don't see the Rosie the Riveter, how it's symbolized out there, but it was a number of Black women who worked in those plants, once the employment opportunities were created. And as soon as the war was over, they were sent back to doing whatever they were doing before. And my mother was, of course, a domestic worker, and she went back to cleaning houses in the suburbs of Detroit. So it starts with the unions there, because the union movement was powerful. I mean, it emerged there when you have the UAW. This is United Automobile Workers. Later on, when we move into the 1960s, 70s, UAW meant you ain't white. Because one of the concerns is kind of racism within the union with not allowing African American promotion. We just kind of confined to being the rank and file and not having leadership or executive roles in that particular union. But all of that's like part and parcel of an evolving race, work consciousness, class consciousness that was a part of Detroit's history. I hit Wayne State University after Malcolm X assassination, on February 21st, 1965. I had come out of the military. And even before the military, I was 20 years of age when I hooked up with Malcolm. Malcolm Doom was my mentor, my everything. And when he was assassinated, he had always said that education was so important. I hadn't been to college. I was 26 years old when I enrolled at Wayne State University. So I got there with all these little 18 and 19-year-olds. So I'm a veteran, man. I've been around the world and read everything. So when the university exploded, when the city exploded in 1967, it gave us an opportunity there to move against the university. And we held that university hostage. In the same way that you had the uprising here at Columbia University, and to some extent right here at City College. Because when Luis Reyes Rivera, I talked to him many, many times about similarities in terms of student uprising and beginning to make demands on that administration. One of the key demands that we had, because Wayne State University, LaRue, was located right in the heart of the black community, but we weren't on campus. You know, so I had worked several months at Dodge, Maine, and some of those individuals who later on would be founding members of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and a number of other union movements that began to coalesce, came together to create, you know, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And it was such a promising moment. And I mean, we just thought the revolution was right around the corner. You know, it was just such a heightened period of political intensity. And Wayne State University was a hotbed of radicalism. And so when I started teaching there in 67, 68, since I had worked at Dodge, Maine, I knew a lot of those workers who were leading that struggle. So I began to work with other community activists and civic leaders and certainly the activist students on campus. We took over the student newspaper. That's the first thing you do. You take over the radio station and the newspaper. And so we had this communication control. We could reach out to other elements of the community, and we began to funnel them onto campus. One of the demands we made, we've got to open up this campus for African-American students. And eventually we had this year critical mass there, so we were able to then put demands on the administration: remedial, tutorial, black studies, more black instructors, increased student population, African American, all these demands, because they're trembling behind the '67 rebellion. They don't want that to happen on campus. So we held them hostage in that sense, and we got the Black Studies programs created. When you have that kind of vortex, then you can have all of the what you call the offshoots of that. One was the Shrine to Black Madonna. This is where, you know, coming out of Reverend Clegg's church, and that's a more revolutionary black nationalism, you know, coming from out of the so-called, you know, religious realm.
Black liberation theology.
Exactly. And then Republic of New Africa, you know, was another element that sprung up right on campus, particularly with people like Robert Williams, Brother Rob, you know, out there, who had that kind of political insight down in Monroe, North Carolina, when he kind of faced off with the Ku Klux Klan. So we had a certain kind of, you know, velocity that we got from these here revolutionary leaders, the James and Grace Lee Boggs, you know, in Detroit. What they meant in terms of coordinating, organizing, systematically among students mainly. So Wayne State University, you know, when they had these founding organizations, at one time I had a class, when I first started teaching at Wayne State University, I had 125 students in the first class I taught, 125 students. And in the front row was the Socialist Workers Party, the Black Panther Party, Shrine to Black Madonna, you know, over here, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, you know, right down the Revolutionary Communist Party. I mean, we had every political stripe was in that classroom. So you can imagine the kind of tricky line I had to walk from an ideological standpoint. I don't want to upset nobody, you know. What's your position? Oh, well, anyway. We'll talk about that after class, you know. But it puts you in a very, it was a very exciting moment in terms of organizing and being informed and making contact, you know, because a lot of those individuals who suddenly, you know, activists on campus had worked on the line with me at Dodge, Maine. So that made it a very easy assimilation, an easy way to adapt to that environment. I had 5 or 6 of them in my class right away. And I knew their working situations. I knew they were hard, trying to hold down a job, trying to take care of a family, and try to go to school. I mean, it's impossible. Later on, I was going to learn that same thing, and you know, at the College of New Rochelle. You know, you remember very well there, in terms of the young ladies who would come. I would have 35 students, and there'd be 33 women. And maybe 2 men. And these women were coming straight from their jobs, working sometimes for the city or state, what have you, and come in there not having a chance even to eat, worn out from the job. And they had signs posted around there, no sleeping, no eating. You know, I say, there's no way in the world this is gonna work like that. Right. So I just let them know, say, we suspend all those rules. Mm-hmm. As I did at Wayne State University, I broke down all barriers between the students and the teachers. Mm-hmm. And I caught a lot of flack on that, so much so that one semester, they harassed me. I had like 250 students behind me. Alex Haley came out with the whole Roots thing, and they wanted to teach a class, and I had 250 students with no TA, no teaching assistant. And so I said, okay, that's fine, you know, we'll take care of that. I gave 200 A's. That's right. Got in trouble again. But I thought they deserved those grades, and I was able to defend that, because based upon who the students were and their interest and motivation in the classroom, this was an elective. It was not a requirement. They chose to come here. And the same thing has happened with Black Studies classes over the years with me. Students get exceedingly high grades. It may have less to do with the actual intellectual acumen they may have, but mostly to do with the interest that they have. And once they have that interest, I can pipe into that. I'll find a way to give you something that'll excite you even more. And I think that's a livelihood that we have to really appropriate and find ways to institutionalize that in such a way from one generation to another. The one thing that's needed more than ever now is the kind of an intergenerational dialogue. Mm-hmm. We need to take advantage of some of these old men who've been out there on the ramparts, on the front line. I always call it, LaRue, the BLM they got to hook up with the BLMs. Black Lives Matter got to hook up with the Black Liberation Movement. Hey. We got to bring those things together in a very, very constructive, concerted, productive way, so we can look at the past. We haven't had a good analysis of what happened in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. You know, the strengths and weaknesses of that, some kind of a dialectical probe of that, has to be done consistently. That's right. I love the energy that's out there now. My concern, I was speaking to Carl, and I know this very well, in terms of how do we grab that energy? How do we sustain it? We saw that whole Occupy movement, it jumped out there for a minute, it dissipated. We got these young people out there on the move now, you know, hey, battling for their lives, you know, against gun control in this country. We got to find a way to sustain that, because we know the current iteration, you know, it's an eruption and it's a response to something that's very close to their lives, very tragically close, and I understand that. But we have to, not beyond sympathizing, how do we organize? That's right. How do we grab that and just parlay that into a movement that could really bring some consequential changes? In a moment, we'll be approaching April 4th, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During the 1960s, we had similar kind of movements in the street, but we also had these voices, some very powerful, charismatic voices, who was able to fill in the gaps when there was no particular incident to sustain it. So we have to find again. I think I saw somebody, that Emma Gonzalez. I mean, I saw some of the young women, particularly, you know, speaking down in Washington D.C. And I was coming back from Medgar Evers College, you know, and I saw them going across the bridge with the signs and everything. I said, that's just absolutely incredibly good, particularly in an age of Trump. That's right. And let me say this here, and maybe we can move on to a broader discussion, is that each week in the Amsterdam News, on the front page, we have an editorial. And I'm up to number 61 now. A year and a few days, a couple of weeks, about Trump must go. And the kind of, some call incipient neo-fascism, but I'm also connected with an organization, and we'll be talking about Refuse Fascism. Mm-hmm. And that's a lesson we have to continue to promote and push out there and bring more voices into this struggle. It's growing, it's becoming increasingly important. and we can see that we can get this sucker on the run. You know, I'm glad to see these women are coming out.
That's right.
Storm on, Stormy, and all the rest of it. Slam him up against the wall, you know. But we got to meet him on that other front, the more important front in terms of he has the ideological thrust from that administration. It's a tsunami of ignorance, a confederacy of dunces. You know, that's essentially what we're looking at there. It's kind of a revolving door, merry-go-round, roulette wheel, you know, an administration that is in chaos. They have no intention. They have a leader who's clueless and rudderless, no idea. The ship of state is heading toward the shoals. We have to go ahead and take advantage of every weakness we can. You know, obstruction of justice, impeachment, whatever.
That's right.
But more than anything, organize in the street, refuse fascism. Thank you very much.
Hey. Yeah, no, that's a clap. That's a clap. Okay. So for our remaining time, I'm going to open up to some Q&A and also give you time to buy some books in the back. Buy some books from a wonderful black bookstore. Maybe even get them signed. I am going to make one serious request. Because we have limited time, make sure your question is a question. I need to be able to do this after it. The floor is open.
Let me get up and look at the folks.
Right on. Take the podium. Take the podium. And I'll let you call. I'll sit back.
I know you've got a question. Talk to me. Oh, you got it.
So my question is, speaking of parallels, what I did about 2 years ago was to take my family and move them to the city of Detroit. And my wife said, well, you know what? I'm moving from Brooklyn. I'm going to get my own house. And I'm coming to the question.
You see me, right?
What's your name?
My name is Alonzo Gabidon. I work here. I went to school here as well. And
What do you do here?
I'm the Director of Student Life and Leadership Development.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
You're okay.
So when we decided to make that move 2 years ago, she said, oh, I'm looking at the houses in Grosse Pointe and I'm like, well, no, sweetie, I'm not going to sell out. We're going to move into Detroit. And we did that. She doesn't want to come back. She's in love. And the question is, right now, we're on the path, and I'm using the word we, are on the path to a renaissance. We just had an election the other day with Coleman Young and Mike Dugan. I feel like the city has this thing where it's, I'm going to say it, Mike Dugan is the white savior. Mm-hmm. And your book talked about self-determination. And a lot of questions that we get asked when we're there is, why Detroit? Mm. Can you answer that question for me?
Sure. And someone else can too. Go ahead, William.
Is that me? It wasn't me, was it? So I'm William Gibbons, and I've lived in.
William, because William and I have been associated for more than a decade here on campus. Mm-hmm. He's out of Detroit. At one point, we've been trying to put our heads together on a couple of book projects. I don't think there's anyone from knowing the infrastructure, knowing anything about the demographics, the layout, and the comparison between Detroit and Harlem, as well as Professor Gibbons. That's why I'm going to give him the first crack at it.
So I moved to New York in 1991, and I was born and raised in Detroit, like 69, you know. And the thing that I was born into, because it was 2 years after the riots, and when there was flight, and you know, the whites left Detroit and moved to the suburbs, they left the city to black folk. And in the 70s, as I'm growing up as a young boy, I turned and all the politicians were black, of color. All the businessmen were of color. The clergy of color. So I grew up and I thought the world was black because everyone around me was of color. And that gave me and my contemporaries a sense of worth. So as it relates to what's happening now, as you mentioned, you know, brothers and sisters are leaving Detroit and they're giving up on Detroit. And I think it's an opportunity for young folk of color to get involved in politics, get involved in urban planning, get involved in revitalizing the city, opening up creative opportunities and businesses, buying homes. Many people here in New York City, in Harlem, and Bed-Stuy, and other neighborhoods didn't see the opportunity to buy, and they had given up. People have given up on Detroit, and they're not buying. And so you can get a 3,000 square foot home with wood ceilings and panels like in this room for $50,000. You can buy, and I'm gonna wrap it up. You can buy Berry Gordy's home for $600,000. So the homes are, and your family has a lot of space. So we have to buy, and even when there's vacant lots and nothing around there, buy the land, you know.
Right on.
No doubt about it. What we recognize, you know, is that downtown Detroit, midtown Detroit, flourishing, flourishing so much so they have it called a queue line. It's not rapid. It moves from downtown to midtown Detroit. Many people compare it to the economic situation in this city. It doesn't go fast enough or far enough. And that's just the beginning. What needs to happen is that we have to extend it beyond downtown Detroit, beyond the midtown Detroit, and out into what's called the exurbia, out to where some of those places where I lived.
That's right.
You know, that are absolutely devastated, dilapidated buildings, you know, where the lights are not on, you know, where the streets are torn apart, where the sewage is in trouble, you know, where there's no stoplights, there's potholes all over the place, there's abandoned. Something has to be done about that before we can talk about a general rejuvenation and revival of that city.
That's right.
And that's the demands that are being made by a number of these young people who live in these neighborhoods. The whole urban agricultural movement that's going. In other words, we're going to feed ourselves because we got a veritable desert there when it comes to major stores, these giant you know, grocers and what have you, not available. They finally got a Whole Foods that moved into Detroit, right down from Wayne State University, moving toward between Midtown and downtown. And you can see the number of people who flood into Whole Foods and support that. But it's just one major outlet. I'm glad to see that Kroger is beginning to move back into the town like it used to be. Matter of fact, they've adopted Black Detroit, and they're gonna have like a 30% discount on Black Detroit for the month of June and July.
Wow.
That ought to stimulate sales.
Okay, my name is Carl Dix. I'm a co-initiator of the group Refuse Fascism that Herb talked about, and a representative of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that I got Herb here, and I'm gonna hit
And ask a great question.
I'm gonna hit you with something that people ask me. Because when I go out to people and say, we got a fascist in the White House, and they have horrors in store for everybody. We got to get them suckers out of there, and all of them, before it's too late. And not to get the Democrats in there, because they ain't in the interest to oppress people either. But we can't let a fascist implement fascism. Folks hit me with, black people already had it bad. Why should we worry about that? See, and they talking to somebody who analyzed, when I started the Stop Mass Incarceration Network, that the situation of black people with police terror and mass incarceration was a slow genocide that could be escalated at any time. So I knew it was already bad.
So what you got, Herb?
But you got these dudes in there who are building up the machinery and everything to escalate it. And so I'm gonna hit you with what somebody said to me. I'm also gonna hit
Wait, you gonna hit him with the answer too? I thought you were gonna let him answer.
I'm gonna tell people somewhere they could go to check this
all
out.
right. We about to have to shut it down.
This film now, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go, A Better World is Possible. I got cards here, you should check it out. But we're gonna hear Herb on this. Herb, black people already had it bad. Why should we worry about Donald Trump?
I tell you what, one of the best students I ever had, who was a student activist and leader here on campus. Come on. Carl, this is the future, baby. Here's the future.
I gotta talk to you, man.
You need to talk to him. You need to talk to him because he is representative, I think, and probably even more so in terms of the 12 years I taught here, the 26 years I taught at the College of New Rochelle, the 15 years I taught at Wayne State University, 2 years I taught at Oberlin, a year I taught at the University of Iowa. Out of all of that, in terms of percentiles, you're in the 5%. You're right up there with him. He was a tremendous thinker, tremendous student. Deal with Carl, Rookie.
Got you.
No, seriously.
Got you. Wow. Thank you. I'm honored to be here and just honored.
Now, let me see this here.
Oh, yeah. Here's just man. So, I'm kind of on edge with your question, right? Because when we talk about politics, right, I think that in this age, like, yes, we need to resist fascism and Donald Trump and all of that. We've been doing that, right? But I think you point to a main point in your book is called self-determination, right? Like, how are we gonna build and organize for ourselves, right? So, one, right, I think there's some things that we have to figure out, right? There's the question of the intergenerational gap that Herb talked about, right? I think that's important, right? How do you connect these movements from Black Lives Matter to the Black Liberation Movement? That's one, right? So I'm giving you steps before we even can get there. I think there's some groundwork that we have to do, right?
Give us short steps.
Yes, so organizing. So, got you, thank you. One, so I think that the intergenerational gap. I also think that there's this national question and international reach, right? Like, how do we build in communal spaces, right? Like Detroit, it said when Detroit caught pneumonia, the international world caught the flu. That was because it had economic power, right? So how are we gonna build communal power, right, between ourselves? Like, are we looking at each other as our brothers and sisters? Are we building that to be able to resist, right? Because no resistance is gonna happen if you can't count on the person next to you to have your back, right? So that's one, right? And also, how do we not only form communities that organize and win, because we do have wins, right? And then when we get hit by the backlash, how do we prepare for that white backlash before it comes and to sustain that movement? So I think those three things, the intergenerational gap, two, the organizing in the communal space to have an international reach, and three, not only just resistance, but sustaining how to move forward. So looking at the history as a way of Sankofa to see how we move forward and sustain it. I think those are 3 steps that we have to get to before we even think about who's in the White House, no matter the year.
Right here, right here. Okay, right here. Give it to the poet. Talk to the poet. This would be the last because we need
That's
to go
right.
ahead
That's right.
and sign a few books.
Okay.
Close it out for me.
Would you like me to read something?
Yes. No, your piece of your poetry.
I got you.
Marilyn was my student at the College of New Rochelle.
Right on.
Her poetry was absolutely astonishing. I love every stanza
Thank you.
breathlessly. I hope you have something we can kind of part with, you know.
I believe this is, instead of me saying we must leave them something. We must leave them behind all that has taught, values given unto me by my parents, following suit to give my children, my family, my community, my religion, my beliefs, my God. Thank you, Queen Mother, for my wisdom to the universe. Make me give love to the world, to you, and maybe you. I must leave them something. Let them talk about the times I almost gave up, surrendering my body, holding tight my mind, my Barbadian heritage, my American style, South Bronx style, of course, giving flavors of my human shell, which matches my inside. Perfectly, I am who I am. Popeye was my hero. Let them show joy when they knew I would never surrender to the sadistic nonsense this world serves on fake silver platters. To you, to me, no thank you. Preach, MTK, 'cause I will leave them the truth. I will leave them honesty. I will leave them lied in pride. Forgiving oneself, acknowledging the truth about yourself. Judging others could be okay as long as you judge your own self. Equally, my children, my family, my friends, spectators, you're hearing me? Healing begins, love fills you, completes you, and listen to the beats that all that the air brings, earth brings, water brings, fire brings around you. Then surrender, and you will always be lovingly free. But I feel I'm missing something more. Give me a moment to think. 10 seconds, please. What do you think? What do I do? We must come together. There is no age difference. We think it's one. Thank you.
So, Brother Boyd will be in the back signing books, but I just want to. You may not. I appreciate your hand, though, brother.
You can
I thank
talk
you.
to me at the
yep.
table.
Well, you'll definitely wrap. Because remember, this is space that we are in, but also space we must vacate, right? I think we all appreciate, or I think more of us should appreciate the genius and generosity that is Herb Boyd, right? Who else takes a Q&A and returns it to the people, right? So I want to thank you as a member of the Black Studies faculty, as a colleague, for all the work that you've done, for being a diamond of Detroit, and really a Harlem's heirloom. We appreciate it, brother.
Beautiful, baby. Thank you.